Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm of course your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 204th episode, our guest is Jessica Ordaz. Jessica Ordaz is an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. She received her doctorate from the University of California, Davis in American history. During the 2017 and 2018 academic year, Ordaz was the Andrew W. Mellon Sawyer Seminar postdoctoral fellow at the University of Washington, which focused on comparative racial capitalism. Her first book, The Shadow of El Centro, A History of Migrant Incarceration and Solidarity, was released in March 2021. Her second project will explore the multifaceted history of veganism and plant-based foods throughout the Americas, focusing on colonization, food, politics, and social justice. This research will illuminate the wider and transnational history of Latinx veganism and how communities of color have engaged with questions of animal, human, and plant relations for centuries. A quick programming note. Her essay, which we discussed during the first part of this episode, is titled The Detention and Deportation Regime as a Conduit of Death, Memorializing and Mourning Migrant Loss, and is included in the book A Field Guide to White Supremacy, edited by Kathleen Ballou and Ramon A. Gutierrez, which will be published Tuesday, October 26, 2021 by the University of California Press. And now on to the show.
My name is Jessica Ordaz, and I am an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder.
And of course, I read your essay in this book here, and it was very informative, very heartbreaking and terrible, of course, but I did learn a lot from it. So how did, I was kind of wanting to go back a little bit, and how did your upbringing and where did you grow up and how did that influence what you focus your studies on now?
Yeah, it definitely shaped my intellectual interests. So I was born and raised in Northern California.
Where?
East Bay, Contra Costa County.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I lived in Ukiah for 3 years.
Okay. Yeah.
More northern, but yeah.
I was going to say yes. Northern California can be a little misleading.
Right. Yeah, it's a big place. So.
Yes, absolutely. But yeah, so I was raised with two first generation migrants from Michoacan, Mexico. My parents who migrated to California in the 1980s. And so really grew up with like their perspectives and their stories as immigrants to the United States. And also raised by a father who for a while was detained and deported right before I was born. And so those experiences definitely not only shaped how I view the world, but sort of my interest in wanting to tell the story and history of migrant incarceration on a broader level in the book, and then more specifically in the article that's part of A Field Guide to White Supremacy.
Yeah, just the whole idea of being deported to a country is so just terrible and scary and dislocating, and just seems like, I just always imagine getting deported and it's like, what do you do? Where do you go? Who do you see? I mean, you lived in this other country. You don't know anybody here. You haven't been around, I mean, I'm sure some people if you were an adult when you left, but it's still got to be just terribly disorienting.
Right. And I found that a lot in my research. So definitely some people will be deported to places where they grew up and they thankfully know folks. But for like now in 2021, we're deporting a lot of people who might not be US citizens, but for the exception of a few months or a few years have spent their entire life in the United States and are definitely deported to places that they don't remember being because they were like babies when they were and don't have any contacts. And so that is scary, and it just adds to the level of things they have to maneuver once they're deported.
Oh, 100%. And you described this in your essay here. You described this as a conduit of death, and I can't help but think that's an accurate description. It's very dehumanizing and seemingly by design that way. It's made to be that way, it seems.
Exactly. At least that's what I'm arguing. And I didn't start there. Like I might have assumed that based on personal experiences, like I said, with my family,
Hmm.
but was very open to following the research archival process and seeing what I found. But just unfortunately, like my work really starts in World War II, 1945, up until the present. And so time and time and time again, example after example, unfortunately, this is what I argue because it's what I found based on the sources.
Hmm. Right. Well, I mean, we even had people saying this openly, and it wasn't just, and I do appreciate your scope in that, this is not a problem that started with Donald Trump. And, of course, he did what he did, but, I remember Mitt Romney talking about people self-deporting because we're going to make it so difficult on them. And, this mentality, and you go to, back to the 50s, all that, it's a long process, bipartisan, it's,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think either party has a monopoly on this, or any one decade for sure.
Right.
Um,
Then actually makes it probably more challenging because with the
yeah,
two system in the United States, then what do you do with that?
right. Well, I guess for people, we're talking about this essay. For people that haven't read the essay, what are some of the bullet points you can give people of some of the things you found in your research?
Yeah, so my specific essay in a field guide to white supremacy focuses on detention and deportation as a regime, as a conduit of death, like you said earlier. And I do two things. One, I'm memorializing the great amount of deaths that have come to pass in the different processes of migration, apprehension, detention, and deportation. But I'm also talking about the systemic avenues that lead to migrant loss. And so I highlight different examples, focusing mostly on the 1990s and the start of the 2000s, but definitely dipping a bit back and a bit forward from there. I talk about the migration and apprehension process during the early 1990s and the shifts that occur in 1994 with NAFTA. So for folks who are not familiar, the North American Free Trade Agreement that just really led and triggered massive migration to the US in terms of destabilizing Mexico's economy, but also Operation Gatekeeper, which was passed during the Clinton administration in 1994, which made it very difficult to cross into the US. And literally, I highlight in the article how policymakers were very aware that instead of actually halting or reducing migration numbers from the Mexican border, the only shift that was going to happen is more people were going to die. And that was just like something they were willing
Hmm.
to allow. And so I discuss that quite a bit. I also talk about violence against migrants from Border Patrol agents while they're crossing as an example of physical violence. I talk about how the greater number and growing number of deaths result in the fact that you have to have like entire cemeteries with these anonymous migrant bodies in these sort of like cemeteries within cemeteries, nameless bodies, because so often migrants don't have identification with them when they're crossing into the United States. And so those are some of the things that I cover, but I also, as a scholar of detention centers, really focus on the detention process and how conditions inside migrant facilities are, but like you said, by design, very violent, so that people self-deport, so that they give up on their asylum claims if they are seeking that. And so that has led to really violent punitive conditions inside of detention facilities. And again, that's not new, but I definitely talk about this period in the 2000s and highlight, for example, the great degree of medical neglect, a lot of death caused from HIV compromised conditions that definitely are treatable, but because of the poor medical care inside facilities, many migrants have passed away. I talk about suicides, which is really hard to read, but I argue that perhaps suicide isn't the best name because they're definitely state influenced in the fact that these are conduits of violence and death. And then lastly, I focus on the process that people undergo once they're deported to their home countries, like we mentioned earlier, and suicides come back up because a lot of folks, rightfully so, experience isolation and depression, which really affects their mental health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It just made me think of that Adam Sir quote about how the cruelty is the point.
Right.
That's kind of it's mean because they want it to be mean. And it's dehumanizing and it's terrible. But like you said about the suicide, I'm just looking at that part of your essay now. It's not an accurate term, is it? Because in a vacuum, these people probably wouldn't be so distraught, if they were treated like human beings, so you're basically leading them to a conclusion, and suicide isn't really the good name for it, I don't think so.
Exactly.
But what kind of things surprised you in your research? You mentioned having your own personal experiences, but looking at the macro picture, is there any part of this research that caught you by surprise, I guess?
Yeah, I think that the level of medical neglect was surprising. So I'm not, surprised that there is different types of violence and abuse inside essentially these carceral spaces, but sort of the degree of medical neglect and dismissal I found very hard to read and write about. So for example, I can share a story here. When I was doing research on the 1980s, a lot of migrants in detention write about in the archives how, they would have different ailments, sometimes as large as suffering from cancer and things like that of that nature. And officials would basically tell them just take Advil for the pain. And so not really dealing with their medical issues at all. And then when I was a postdoc student in Washington a few years ago, I went to a detention facility nearby. They were having an event. And so there were activists reading different testimonies from people inside the facility. And this was 4 years ago. So long after the 1980s. And as the activist was reading this letter, the person who was detained inside literally was saying the same things, like, I have these and these medical conditions, and guards basically just tell me, just take your Advil, we can't do anything for you. And I remember having to leave and just being so uncomfortable that nothing has changed, and nothing had changed from the 1980s to the 2000s. And that was just so the degree was very surprising and disturbing to me.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, and that kind of proves that this approach doesn't even work. Like if you're actually trying to reduce migration, you haven't, because people are still just desperate for survival, and you making it harder on them isn't going to make their situation that they're coming from any less desperate. So they're still willing to go through the potential of this to get to this country, and it's just mind-boggling. It's not even effective to be mean to people. It's just mean. It's not even good policy.
Right. And I think the way I see it is because the goal is not necessarily to altogether reduce migration as it is to manage migration, right? So in a capitalist society, the United States needs a labor force that can be exploited. And so I don't think policymakers are interested in reducing, let's say, migration from Latin America by a lot. I think the goal is to manage it so that you don't have a country full of migrants and all of the implications, while still having access to a percentage that can be used as an exploitable labor force.
Yeah, that's the part that I never really understood because, Republicans love free and cheap labor, but
Right.
then again, it's like it's like the capitalism, the racism, they fight, who will win? Whoever wins, we both lose.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is a need for a permanent underclass, isn't there? I mean, somebody's gonna pick the fields, and it's not gonna be them, So they got to have somebody do that. Then again, they want to clamp down on it so hard, and yeah, it's just like they have to just do it enough to like keep the balances in line. It's really a sick game.
Right.
Um, but yeah, gosh, it's just such a distressing topic, and it doesn't seem like there's any hope on the horizon, at least at the moment of things getting better. I think we all saw the pictures of the Haitian migrants and the people on the horseback. It was just awful. So it's like the saga continues. It doesn't, President Biden is continuing that policy, and
Right.
it just keeps going. Do you see any change on the horizon, or is it just more of the same?
Yeah, I think it definitely goes back to what you mentioned earlier about this issue really being bipartisan, right? And so historically and contemporarily, we've seen people across the political spectrum advocate for measures that on the ground end up being very violent for migrants throughout the entire detention and deportation regime. And so this is one of the reasons why I ask certain questions, not necessarily in the article, but in my book, The Shadow of El Centro, more broadly, where I talk about, the function and the root of migrant incarceration really being to be intentionally, like you say, cruel, or the words I use are punitive and instructive and violent. And so, if that's true, I don't see things changing in terms of reforming parts of the system. Personally, I'm an abolitionist of migrant incarceration because I really feel like, as someone who's traced that history, it has been violent from the very beginning, and that hasn't changed regardless of who's been in office.
Hmm. Right, right. And I feel like there was a time, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago or something, that seemed like there was some hope of some sort of immigration reform, but it just seems like that's totally fallen apart. And I don't see anyone, when we were debating, like we were mentioning the dreamers before, sort of, and that's such a no-brainer to me. Like, yeah, let them stay. They don't remember not being here. What are you going to send them to? Like, of course, just let them be here. Why not? And that was an issue. And it's like, oh, come on, we can't even agree on that much. Like, that's the easiest one. Like,
Right. Well, and the thing with policy is that it's a compromise, right? So a good example that I like to share with my students is one of the biggest immigration examples of reform was during the Reagan administration. And yes, a lot of people were able to stay in the United States with amnesty, and that was seemingly a positive. But then, if you analyze a lot of the Reagan administration's immigration policies, it actually created more infrastructure for today's deportation and detention regime. And so that's the thing too with reform, is that it comes with compromise. And in the long term, we see its negative effects. So that's one example I like to bring up.
right, right. And then we haven't even gotten to the broken families and the kids being ripped from their parents, and it's just there's no putting this back together for these people. Some of them, I mean, I guess we can try to find some family members, or try to fix what's been broken, but I don't know how we're going to do it in every case, and it just seems like somebody should have known that this was not a good policy, and separating families, and it's just that was just such a heartbreaking episode from the last few years. So
Yeah, yeah, and sort of going back to different administrations, unfortunately, what happened is in equating so many of those horrific policies and practices of family separation with Trump, is that once Trump is no longer in office, the like focus, the highlight and focus on the issue sort of is watered down now under Biden, even though, like you said, things have continued. So that's a flaw in associating some of these practices with any one administration.
Oh yeah. Well, now that goes to something I was thinking about the other day. It's just like a lot of our problem. I mean, many of our problems are not 4 or 8 year problems. Like the the solution, if there is one, will take much longer than that. And who knows who's going to be in charge in between that time, and who's going to come out on top. And one person might go this way and then the next person might take it back this way, and it's like these problems have been going on for like 50 years. Like it's not within the term of one president that it could possibly be done. So I don't know. I don't know, make somebody a dictator for life, probably not a good answer, but you know what I mean? Like it just seems like such a small amount of time, and this whole system that you described is just so fundamentally broken. It seems like it's larger than one administration could or would fix. So
Right.
But yeah. But it's a very well done essay. I had a real hard time reading it. I'll be real honest.
No, it's definitely a very heavy topic
for sure.
and I had a hard time writing it.
Yeah, I'll bet. I did look on your biography here, and I did want to ask you about veganism, because I am interested in that too. Talk about your project that you're working on now with that.
Yeah, so once The Shadow of El Centro was published in March, I made quite a bit of progress thinking about a second project. And personally, I've been vegan now for 4 years, so not a super long time, but have become increasingly passionate about veganism in my personal life, and decided that I would love to explore that topic a bit more, specifically historicizing like the longer lineage and roots of veganism, because the term is coined in Europe in the 1940s. But I'm really exploring and wanting to argue that if we look at, say, the Americas, there are so many different foods and practices that are vegan-like, that are an important part of this narrative and the struggle, that are not necessarily acknowledged within mainstream white veganism, I don't think, from what I've seen these last 4 years or so. And so that's something that I'm increasingly interested in. And in addition to this book that I'm working on, which is specifically on Latinx veganism, I'm also starting a podcast that explores a similar topic with a friend of mine.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've always been interested in veganism and vegetarianism. It would be very difficult for me to imagine doing it all the way, but how did you get interested in it at first?
Yeah, well, I finished the PhD and
Okay.
had some time as a postdoc student in Seattle, and Seattle's just very vegan friendly. And so it was easy to have the time and the space and the resources for the first time in a long time to really think about food and my relationship with food and animals, and something that I had always like been interested in but had never made the leap, and just like made some good vegan friends while I was there, and seeing them cook and cook with them made me realize that it was possible. And I at first just tried it, like, okay, let's see how it goes, kind of transitioning to veganism, not expecting it to stick, and it did. It did. And so now I definitely consider myself an intersectional vegan, and am vegan for all different kinds of reasons, such as animal liberation and all of these, important causes. But initially it was more thinking about my health and how badly I treated myself in grad school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I I guess my biggest concerns, because I mean ethically, yeah, I get that. I totally understand that. The animal cruelty and the factory farming and all that kind of stuff. You don't need to convince me. I understand. But for me, protein seems like a hard one. How do you get what's your main sources of protein? Where do you go for that?
Yeah, so a lot of plants have protein. Of course, it's not in
Mm-hmm.
like greatest quantities, but like beans and legumes have quite a bit of protein. So that's my go-to for
Mm.
that. Um, yeah, and so it's good to remind myself that like the protein we get from animals is the plants that those animals are eating. And so
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
always straight to the source.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
What was the hardest to give up when you gave up meat?
The hardest was not me actually, because even when I was a lot younger living with my parents, they're not big meat eaters. They mostly
Mm.
eat some seafood and chicken. So that was
Okay.
not that challenging for me. I think what was more challenging was dairy, actually.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, are you ever like tempted to break your veganism? Is there ever like a really good meal in front of you and you're like, maybe just this once? Nothing that you've been good?
I, you know, if one day, because you never know, if one day I'm not vegan, I don't think it would be because like I'm craving a certain food. It's more that sometimes it's very inconvenient, right? So
Yes, absolutely.
I
Uh-huh.
live in Denver, Colorado, and thankfully it is a very vegan friendly city.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm out and about not cooking for myself, I have plenty of options. But that's
Mm-hmm.
not always true. Like, for example, my hometown in the East Bay, it's far enough east that it's a small town. Um, with just like chain restaurants, and I can't even think of a single like fully vegan place there. That would be
Mm.
really difficult. And so I don't think it's like a food that I would crave. It's more just like in some spaces you don't have the access and resources to eat an all vegan diet, or
Right.
to practice veganism in its
Mm-hmm.
holistic meaning. And so I think that would be more what would happen in this potential hypothetical future.
Right. No, no doubt. But do you find yourself, because this is another thing I've heard, do you find yourself eating just greater quantities of food now because you're vegan?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Oh, I said, do you find yourself eating greater quantities of food just because you need, like you said, that plants have protein, but it's not like that concentrated hit of meat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I would say
No, normal sized meals, normal amount
yeah,
is okay.
about the same that I did before.
Okay. All right. I just didn't know if you had to had to eat like a lot, just a greater quantities of food because you're trying to get everything you need. But
Right.
no, I've had great vegan food. I worry about my own getting everything that I would need, I guess. I just I've never really thought about that. I've thought about doing it for a short period of time, but never for a long period of time. But I am interested in it. So yeah, it's amazing. 4 years. So that's that's a long time.
Yeah.
Um but what are your favorite vegan dishes? Like if you're trying to show somebody like, okay, vegan food is actually good, like what would you make them?
I will admit, I'm not the best cook in
Okay,
the
well,
world.
you're at a restaurant. What would you
Yeah,
order
I
for
was gonna say,
someone?
if that
You
really
you
came
don't have to
down
do
to
the
like
cooking. It's
that,
okay. It's okay.
I would absolutely take them to one of the many
There you
great
go.
vegan restaurants in Denver. I cook a lot of basics, like I said, so like legumes, lentils, salads, things like that. But if I am wanting to like treat myself or take somebody out and show them like a nice place to eat vegan, one of my favorite restaurants is called Calos in Denver, and it's actually a Mexican restaurant from Michoacan, which is where my parents are from in Mexico. And they're not fully vegan, but like a really large percentage of their menu is vegan.
Hmm.
And because it's Mexican owned, like the food to me tastes really good, and authentic. That could be a problematic term, but authentic, we'll just say that.
Hmm.
Um, and that's not always the case in Denver. And so that's really lovely that I can just like order something that is nostalgic and reminds me of childhood foods, and happens to be fully vegan.
Hmm. Okay. Now, do you eat any of the Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger? Because like here's my thing about those. They do, I've had those, and if you just told me that it was meat, I probably would have not even known. Uh, but the thing is, it's so processed. I mean, they have to do so much to it to get it to taste like that, right? It's not just like that normally. So that almost seems like the health benefit is being counteracted by the amount of processing that has to go into the food. You know what I mean?
Right,
So,
right. I was actually just having this conversation the other day. So I have had Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers, mostly because in restaurants that are only like, they have vegan options, but they're not fully vegan, that seems to be like
hmm.
their go-to
Yep.
is a burger. And so
Yep.
when I've been in a pinch, I tend to order that. It's not my favorite. I don't necessarily feel like I need to replicate the taste of beef, which is what they're trying to do.
Hmm.
And you're right. So I mentioned earlier that I cook a lot of like basic staples like lentils, and that's because I not always succeed, but try to eat slightly less processed foods. And so I will eat them on occasion, but they're not my favorite.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes all you can have is the bean burger, it's like that's what's available.
Right.
But now here's another question though. Would you eat the cultured meat? You've heard of this, right?
I
The
have.
lab grown meat. Would you do that? It's cruelty free. So,
I
that
mean,
takes that concern away, but it's still, technically meat. Or I guess
right.
it is. I don't
So,
know. Is it meat?
right, right. I mean, I wouldn't personally, just because like I said, I'm not necessarily craving things
Hmm.
that taste like meat or
Yeah. Hmm.
substitute meat.
Yeah.
So not necessarily, but yes, there is a growing plethora of alternatives.
Hmm. I see. Yeah, I see why people say, "Oh, this or that tastes like this meat product or whatever." But I feel that like that sets you up for disappointment almost, because it's just like if you just told me it was a thing, I would just assume it was the thing, and I wouldn't be comparing it to the other
Right.
thing. But I'm like, oh, I don't know. This really doesn't taste like the thing you say it does. Yeah, it's kind of I don't know. It's kind of a losing proposition for me, but yeah, I'm very interested in it. I'm only asking all these questions because I've thought about this so much myself, but I've never actually done the work myself to go all
Yeah.
the way.
Yeah.
Now, why did you go for the full? You mentioned your reasoning a little bit, but why did you go for the full veganism and not vegetarian or pescatarian, some other in between? You went all the way.
Yeah, I think it was the people I was becoming friends with
Mm,
were vegan. And so I didn't really think too much about it, but now it definitely makes sense in terms of my ethics. And the dairy industry is also very awful, as we know, to like dairy
mm,
cows, for example.
sure.
And so ethically, it just made sense. But initially, I think it was just that like the people I was cooking with were vegan and not
Mm.
vegetarian.
Oh, that makes sense for sure. Now going back a little bit to the history of veganism, can you explain a little bit more about that? Because I sort of think when I think of veganism, it seems like a newer idea that people have had, but it's not really, right? It's an older idea.
Well, the term is relatively new. It was
Hmm.
coined in 1944 in England. By a person's name who I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, 1944. And so that was the first time that veganism was coined as this movement that was not only vegetarian, but strictly vegan, meaning that to the best of one's ability, you would not consume animal products. So really thinking about meat and dairy and leather and all these other products that have animal and any type of animal, anything
Hmm.
related to them. And so the term technically is relatively new, and so like mainstream veganism is relatively new. But like I mentioned earlier, like people have been eating largely vegetarian and vegan diets mostly out of like poverty reasons, right? So like
Hmm.
meat is expensive.
Mm.
And so I know my family, for example, my dad would talk about when I was little, like how he grew up eating beans, like just a pot of beans, because he had like a lot of brothers and sisters, and that just made more sense financially in his town in Michoacan. And so that's like still a slightly relatively new example. But yeah, like indigenous societies, say in Mexico City, which is at the time was known as Tenochtitlan, at the height of the Aztec or Mexica Empire, they did eat things like rabbits, but cows is like a European, a process of European colonization, right? There were no
Mm.
cows in the Americas until Europeans colonized different indigenous societies and brought them with them. And so that's, I think, a part of the narrative that's missing from understanding veganism, is that a lot of today's uses of meat and dairy can be seen as like this older form of changing indigenous diets and ways of living and food ways.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think part of my, ability to still eat, meat is that I am so separated from the process of of getting the meat. And I think if I was like living among animals more, I guess maybe I would at least think harder about that part of it. But I feel like in our modern society, it's so easy to be detached.
Well, and I would argue that's intentional,
Oh,
right?
well, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if we all actually saw what goes into our food, there's a lot of
Oh
things
my
that
gosh.
terrify us.
I can I can hardly stand to read the label sometimes, let alone like watch the harrowing video from the slaughterhouse. Like I
Right.
can't. Goodness gracious. Well, yeah, that's really fascinating. Um, well, another thing I read in your bio that I did want to ask you about, because I've kind of been thinking about this term, Latinx. That is a term that has kind of come about in the last few years. However, some of the like I mentioned, I lived in Ukiah for a while, and some of the older Mexican gentlemen that I knew, I'm not sure that they would use that term. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I don't feel like that they would. But where did that term come from? How is it used? Who uses it, and why? I'm very interested.
Yeah. So younger generations have definitely wanted an alternative that is not so gendered, right? Spanish is very gendered.
Mm,
And so it's an alternative that is non-binary and more inclusive in a lot of ways by putting the X instead of an A or an O, because people don't always identify with those identities. And so this is a term that's been used in my lifetime, right? So I
mm,
remember these transitions when I was in college many years ago. What people would do is like the at symbol.
mm.
And that was popular for a
Oh,
time. And then
interesting.
more recently, the X was included. But you're right that like it's definitely controversial. And a lot of people who are very invested in maintaining certain notions of Spanish and language don't like it because they either say it's confusing. There's lots of reasons, right? Either they think it's
Hmm.
confusing, they think it's not proper, or they just don't care about a non-binary alternative.
Hmm.
Um, and so I use it if I'm talking about our contemporary moment. But for example, in my book, The Shadow of El Centro, exactly what you just said, for those reasons, I realized like, okay, the migrants that I'm writing about in the 1940s would never have identified as
Right. They wouldn't have known what you were talking
And
about.
so I don't use that term in those moments,
Right.
but I do use it in our present, whether I'm speaking
Mm.
to someone or whether I'm talking about like the last, I don't know, 7 years or so in
Yeah.
my writing. And so it's something that like I want to be inclusive to folks and how they identify, but yes, it's definitely a contested term.
Thank you for talking to me for so long about all these things. I hope I didn't ask any stupid questions along the way. So I'm fascinated in all this stuff, especially the veganism and all that. But the question I asked before we go here is, what music have you been listening to lately?
Yeah, so yesterday and today I've been listening on repeat to Chicano Batman because they're actually going to be in Denver, and it's a group band that I really like, and I'm going to see them on Thursday, and so they've been in my background these last few days.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, I've heard of them somewhere. I'm trying to remember what I've heard them from. What would their big song be?
Oh,
no, they had a Tiny Desk concert. That's why I know who they are. Yep, I've seen that.
I was actually just listening to the Tiny Desk concert today. Yeah, so they're from Los Angeles,
Nice.
in California. They're Chicano, hence the name.
Very cool.
And they will be in Denver on Thursday.
Awesome. Well, geez, I'll have to get this out before then so people can go. Well, great. Well, I thank you again for taking so much time to talk to me, and I appreciate. I'll read whatever books you have coming out here. I know you already have one, and you got another coming out, so I'd be interested in reading whatever else you have coming up, and talk to you again here. So,
thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for chatting with me.
Oh, no problem. Well, thank you again, and yeah, have a great night. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye-bye. Join the Rob Burgess Show mailing list. Go to tinyletter.com/The Rob Burgess Show and type in your email address. Then respond to the automatic message. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review everywhere the podcast is available, including iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, RSS, and now Spotify. The official website for the podcast is www.therobburgessshow.com. You can find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. If you have something to say, record a voice memo on your smartphone and send it to therobburgesshow@gmail.com. Include voice memo in the subject line of the email. Also, if you want to call or text the show for any reason, the number is 317-674-3547. Until next time.